Pete Sampras used to be the perfect embodiment of American sports glory. A champion who needed no excuses, no side stories, just cold, absolute numbers. 14 Grand Slam titles, 7 Wimbledon trophies, 5 U.S. Open championships, 2 Australian Opens, 286 weeks as the world number one, 6 straight years, finishing the season at the top of the ATP rankings. Those achievements didn't just put Sampras at the peak of tennis, they turned him into the gold standard for what an ideal champion looked like in the American mind. On court, he didn't need flash, didn't need drama, didn't need to entertain. That icy serve, that brutally precise game, that silent ability to finish opponents made Sampras the perfect winning machine. He didn't just win, he dominated. He didn't just collect titles, he redefined consistency. Throughout the 1990s, when American tennis was looking for an icon to counterbalance the chaos, impulsiveness, and raw emotion of other stars, Sampras stood there like a fortress. Solid, reliable, unbreakable. To the public, Pete Sampras was the man who did everything right. Talent, discipline, victory, and walking away at the very top with no stains left behind. But that very perfection hid a pain that stretched across 30 years, a mental price no one could see. To become the man who never crumbled on court, Sampras had to learn how to shut off emotion, swallow fear, and live by a ruthless rule. Weakness was not allowed. One life as the champion performed in front of millions of eyes, and another life quiet, isolated, where every wound was locked tight behind the door of discipline. He didn't live 2 lives because he was lying. He did it to survive. Every victory became a new layer of armor. Every title a way to postpone facing himself. Sampras never learned how to tell his inner story, because very early on, he was taught that feelings don't help you win matches. When the crowd cheered, he stayed silent. When failure came, he closed up even tighter. Sampras's will wasn't about how strong he was, it was about how long he could endure when nobody bothered to ask if he was okay. And when his career ended, when the role of champion was gone, that man didn't collapse in public, didn't seek pity. He simply chose to disappear, carrying with him all the pain of someone who had lived his entire life for victory, but was never allowed to live fully for himself. If you want to understand what really happened behind Pete Sampras's silence, don't go anywhere, because the next part will reveal the years that shaped the man before he became a legend. Hit subscribe so we can keep diving together into the tragic, honest, and deeply human stories of America's icons. Pete Sampras wasn't born into a noisy family, nor did he grow up surrounded by hugs or excessive words of encouragement. His home was a place where order came before emotion, where discipline was seen as a virtue, and weakness was best kept hidden. Pete's parents loved their kids in their own way, but it was a practical, quiet, low-word kind of love, not accustomed to checking in on feelings. In a family with many children, Pete was the least troublesome kid, and therefore also the least noticed. He didn't cry loudly, didn't rebel, didn't demand attention. He learned silence very early, not because he was mature, but because he understood that silence kept him from becoming a burden. No one ever asked Pete if he was sad, if he was scared, if he was lonely. Those questions simply didn't exist in daily life. There, people only asked, "Are you doing well? Are you disciplined? Are you improving?" Pete grew up in an atmosphere where emotions were treated like a luxury. When he felt sad, there was no place to say it. When he felt disappointed, there was no one to share it with. And so he learned to swallow everything inside, just like many American kids raised in a culture that sees strength as the only acceptable standard for men. No one taught Pete how to handle sadness, but life kept putting him in situations that forced him to figure it out alone. He understood that if he wanted to survive, he had to control himself before controlling anything else. That wasn't a choice. It was a survival reflex formed day by day, year by year, in complete silence. Tennis came to Pete as a refuge, not because of joy, but because of its silence. On the court, no one required him to speak his feelings. No one asked if he was okay. Everything was measured by action. Serve, move, win or lose. There, Pete didn't have to explain himself. He just had to do it right. Tennis became the only language he felt safe using, because it was a language that didn't demand words. The more he practiced, the more the world felt controllable. Every precise shot was a moment of restored order. Every small victory was proof that he had value, even if no one ever said it out loud. While other kids learned how to express emotions, Pete learned how to lock them away. He didn't know what he was missing, because he had never been shown any other option. Tennis wasn't just a sport. It was the mental structure that helped him survive. There, he wasn't the overlooked kid, wasn't the one standing outside the family conversation. He was the one controlling the rhythm, the one deciding the outcome. And that control gave him a sense of safety that everyday life could never provide. Gradually, Pete began to identify himself with the court. Off the court, he was quiet. On the court, he was sharp. Off the court, he learned to endure. On the court, he learned to impose. These two worlds existed side by side from very early on, even though back then no one called it a double life. It was just the way a child adapted to an environment that didn't allow him to be weak. Pete didn't cry, not because he didn't hurt, but because he saw no benefit in crying. Tears didn't earn him recognition. Emotions didn't earn him attention. Only results did. Looking back, people might call Pete Sampras a natural-born talent, but behind that talent was a child who learned to suppress before he learned to dream. A child who understood that to be allowed to stay, to be seen, he had to become perfect, or at the very least, not cause any trouble. The tragedy of Pete didn't start with a big event. There was no clear shock or shattering trauma. It started with the absence of the simplest questions. How do you feel? And that very absence shaped an entire life, where emotions were compressed so tightly they became part of his inner structure, cold, dry, and terrifyingly durable. From that moment on, Pete Sampras was no longer a child learning to play tennis. He became a person learning to survive by not revealing. Tennis didn't make him happy, but it gave him a place to stand. And sometimes, for a child who was used to never being asked how he felt, just having a place to stand was more than enough. From very early on, Pete Sampras realized that there was one single place in this world where everything didn't betray him, wasn't vague, didn't change based on someone else's emotions. That place was the tennis court. There, no one asked how he felt, but no one judged him based on what he didn't say either. Everything had rules. Every line was clear. Every point was recorded. No surprises from adult glances. No confusing silences in family rooms. No hazy expectations that a child couldn't put into words. On the court, the world became neat, orderly, and most importantly, controllable. For Pete, it wasn't just a sport. It was a mental bunker, a place he retreated to whenever the outside world became too complicated to understand. Pete began spending more hours on the court than anywhere else, not because of pure passion, but because there, he didn't have to explain his own existence. Every practice session stretched out like a repeated ritual, where the body was pushed to its limits, so the mind had no room left for uncomfortable questions. He hit the ball hundreds of times, thousands of times, repeating the same motion, the same trajectory, the same breathing rhythm. That repetition brought a sense of safety. In Pete's world, the fewer variables, the less pain, and tennis, with its strict structure, gave him exactly that. He didn't play to be noticed. He played to disappear. When sweat dripped down, when his grip tightened on the racket, when all his focus poured into the oncoming ball, Pete was no longer the overlooked kid, no longer the boy who had to swallow his emotions. He became a pure entity of action. There were no feelings to process, only tasks to complete. Every precise shot felt like a silent affirmation that he still existed, that he could still control something in a world that never took the time to listen to him. But the price of that safety was an ever-deepening isolation. The better Pete got at tennis, the further he drifted from his real self. While other kids learned how to build relationships, how to argue, reconcile, and connect, Pete learned how to shrink himself into a space that contained only him and the ball. Tennis became the only language he truly mastered, to the point where every other language gradually became foreign. He never learned how to name his own emotions. He never learned how to face hurt. He only learned how to win, and win cleanly, leaving no trace. People often praise Sampras's extraordinary focus, his ability to detach from pressure and play like a machine. But few understand that this focus wasn't a gift. It was a defense mechanism. Pete didn't concentrate to excel. He concentrated to not feel. The more he focused, the less he had to face the empty spaces inside. The more disciplined he became, the less he had to ask questions he didn't know how to answer. Tennis didn't teach Pete how to live, but it taught him how to survive without collapsing. Gradually, the court stopped being a part of Pete's life and became his entire life. Off the court, he was awkward, quiet, uncomfortable with social interactions that had no structure. On the court, he was sharp, decisive, almost emotionless. These two people existed side by side, but only one was allowed to appear before the world. And that one didn't know how to be weak, didn't know how to admit fear, didn't know how to stop. Pete didn't escape life through destructive behavior, rebellion, or breaking rules. He escaped through absolute compliance. By turning himself into the version every coach wanted, every system could easily accept a child who caused no trouble, an athlete who never complained, a machine being slowly sharpened. But in the process, he lost the chance to learn how to live as a complete human being. When victory came, it didn't bring explosive joy. It only brought temporary relief, as if a threat had just been postponed. Winning wasn't a reward. It was the condition for Pete to stay inside his safe bunker. Losing, on the other hand, wasn't just a sporting failure. It was a risk of being forced to face the outside world, where there were no clear rules, where emotions couldn't be measured by points. So Pete kept winning relentlessly, not out of a hunger for glory, but out of fear of what would happen if he didn't win. Tennis taught Pete how to control his body to an almost absolute degree, but it didn't teach him how to accept human imperfection. He became obsessed with precision, with making no mistakes, with keeping everything under control. And that very obsession slowly strangled the remaining human part inside him. Pete Sampras never learned how to live among complicated relationships, overlapping emotions, irreparable wounds. He only learned how to stand firm on the court, where everything could be fixed with a better shot on the next point. That mental bunker protected Pete from collapse for many years, but it also isolated him from the world, from himself, and from the possibility of healing. And when a person spends their entire youth learning how to win without learning how to live, the price doesn't come immediately. It arrives slowly, silently, accumulating through every season, every match, every moment Pete chose to turn his back on emotion just to keep standing. Tennis was the only place Pete Sampras felt safe, but it was also the very place that taught him how to drift away from himself without even realizing it. When Pete Sampras crossed the line from a promising young talent to a true professional athlete, that shift happened quietly but irreversibly. There was no coming-of-age ceremony, no moment allowed for hesitation. The world around him only saw one thing: a winning machine slowly taking shape. On the court, Pete grew colder, more precise, less expressive. He didn't over-celebrate, didn't overreact to pressure, didn't show any emotional cracks. To the fans and the media, This was a sign of maturity, of steely resolve. To Pete, it was simply the next step in perfecting a survival mechanism assembled since childhood. To survive, you must control. To be allowed to stay, you must be perfect. On the outside, Pete Sampras's image became almost spotless. A champion who wasn't loud, wasn't caught in scandals, didn't need to tell his life story to be loved. Everything about him was clean, neat, orderly. His serve was programmed like a Swiss watch. His net approaches that finished opponents were decisive, merciless. Pete didn't need to look fierce to dominate. His silence alone was enough to unnerve opponents. He became the embodiment of doing it the right way in American sports. Work hard, don't complain, win through discipline. And America loved him for it. But behind that perfect shell was an increasingly suffocating space, where anxiety had no outlet. Pete didn't fear any specific opponent. He feared failure as a concept. Failure, to him, wasn't just losing a match. It was the risk of being seen, judged, questioned. It was the threat of being pulled out of the safe bunker that tennis had built for him over the years. Every potential loss carried the danger of collapsing the entire control structure he relied on to survive. So Pete played under a pressure few could see. The pressure of not being allowed to make a mistake. The fear of abandonment also grew quietly alongside his fame. When victories came, they brought attention, expectations, and eyes demanding more the next time. Pete understood that the public's love for a champion is always conditional. Today, they cheer you for winning. Tomorrow, they can turn away if you're no longer perfect. And because he didn't know how to build self-worth off the court, Pete had to cling tightly to the role of champion. He didn't allow himself to slow down, didn't allow himself to weaken, because he didn't know who he would be without victories to shield him. The two people began to separate clearly. One, Pete Sampras, public, exemplary, efficient, always doing everything right. And another Pete Sampras inside, living with unanswered questions, unnamed fears. That second person didn't appear at press conferences, didn't step onto the court, wasn't allowed to show up in front of cameras. He existed only in the rare moments between matches, in empty locker rooms, in hotel nights where the applause had long faded. But even there, Pete didn't permit himself to collapse. He kept silent as a form of self-defense. No one detected that fragmentation because Pete never complained. He didn't gripe about the schedule, didn't talk about mental pressure, didn't blame circumstances. In a sports world used to endless stories of overcoming adversity, Pete's silence was mistaken for strength. Coaches believed he was fine. Teammates believed he had everything under control. The media believed he was simply that kind of person. And Pete, accustomed to never being asked, didn't expect anyone to see him differently. The winning machine kept running smoothly, but each rotation consumed another piece of the real person. Pete began living on such a strict schedule that there was no room left for spontaneity. Everything was calculated. Training, eating, resting, competing. Emotions, if they appeared, had to be extinguished quickly. They were seen as interference, as risks to performance. Pete didn't hate emotions, he simply didn't know what to do with them. And without tools to handle them, he chose to eliminate them. The suffocation didn't come from one specific event, but from the terrifying accumulation of identical days. Win, train, win, again. Each victory resolved the immediate fear, but at the same time reinforced the loop. To stay safe, you must keep winning. Pete didn't live in the moment. He lived in the constant postponement of fear. When would everything finally be allowed to stop? When would he finally be allowed to breathe? Those questions were pushed back, year after year, by the very shining trophies the world admired. On the outside, Pete Sampras became the symbol of stability, of unflinching standards. On the inside, he gradually lost the ability to distinguish between the person and the role. He was no longer sure which part was him living and which part was him enduring. The two lives ran parallel, never intersecting, separated by discipline and silence. And because Pete was so good at hiding, because he never showed a single public crack, that central tragedy kept playing out without anyone knowing. Pete Sampras's double life didn't begin with lies, but with adaptation. It wasn't built to deceive others, but to protect a child who learned not to cry, a man who learned not to speak. In a world that worships strength and victory, Pete chose to become perfect so he wouldn't be abandoned. But the price of that perfection was an inner life strangled, where every pain had to be borne in silence. And as those two people grew farther apart, the tragedy was no longer about whether Pete would keep winning, but about whether he would still recognize himself when no one was watching anymore. Pete Sampras stepped into the U.S. Open in 1990 as a promising young face, but he left that tournament as a champion that stunned the entire country. At 19 years old, he beat bigger, more seasoned, more experienced names and stood on top of Arthur Ashe Stadium with the first Grand Slam trophy in his hands. To the media, it was the perfect sports fairy tale. Natural talent, youth, historic victory. America loves stories like that. They hailed Pete Sampras as the future of tennis, as the new model of an American champion, young, disciplined, scandal-free. In that moment, everything seemed predestined. A great career had just begun. But what the crowd couldn't see was the cold emptiness inside the man who had just lifted the cup. When the applause thundered through the stands, Pete didn't feel the explosive joy people expected. There was no emotional release, no sense of being fully alive in the moment. The victory came too fast, too soon, like a hard blow to the body of someone who hadn't yet figured out who he was. Pete stood there, performing the rituals of a champion, but inside, he didn't know where to put his feelings. He had won, but he didn't know what to win for beyond winning again. At 19, Pete Sampras hadn't had time to become a full adult. He hadn't had enough failures, enough self-doubt, enough chances to try different paths in life. Instead, he was thrust straight into the role of national champion, a role that demanded stability, composure, and endurance that even many grown men struggled to carry. No one asked Pete if he was ready. No one asked how he felt when the whole world suddenly turned its eyes on him. They just assumed that winning was what everyone wanted, and therefore the winner must be happy. But Pete didn't know who to share that joy with. He wasn't used to expressing emotions, especially positive ones, that made him just as awkward as sadness. His peers couldn't understand the pressure of a Grand Slam champion. His family was proud, but they didn't have the shared language to talk about the overwhelming feeling Pete was going through. His coaches saw a talent that had been proven, a winning machine now in full gear. And Pete, used to never being asked, didn't speak up. He stayed silent, the way he had since he was a kid. The U.S. Open win didn't bring Pete a sense of safety. Instead, it opened up a whole new layer of pressure. Now, he didn't just have to win to survive. He had to win to protect the image that had been built around him. From that point on, failure was no longer a normal possibility. It became a threat to the entire story America had just placed on his shoulders. Pete understood that, even if no one said it out loud. And because he understood, he closed up even tighter, controlled even more rigorously, and allowed himself even less room to show anything that could be seen as weakness. In the days after the win, as the media lights dimmed, Pete returned to his hotel room with a feeling that was hard to name. It wasn't sadness, and it wasn't joy. It was the emptiness of someone who had just achieved what the whole world called the peak, but couldn't find the answer to the next question. And then what? For Pete, the answer was very clear and very frightening. Keep winning. There was no pause to reflect, no space to grow outside the court. Winning became an obligation, no longer a reward. Pete's loneliness wasn't loud or dramatically tragic. It was functional loneliness, a person who still performed efficiently, still completed tasks, but grew increasingly disconnected from himself inside. Pete moved from tournament to tournament, from city to city, with a packed schedule and an inner world that was slowly running dry. He was surrounded by fans, by media, by expectations, but rarely close to anyone who truly saw him as an incomplete human being. Winning too early stole from Pete the chance to make mistakes in the dark. Every error he made now happened under the lights, in front of millions of eyes. That made him afraid to experiment, afraid to take risks, afraid to live differently. He clung tightly to the template that had brought him initial success, because it was the only thing he knew would keep him safe. And in the process, Pete gradually equated his self-worth with his results on court, a dangerous equation he didn't have enough distance to recognize. The whole country cheered Pete Sampras as the youngest champion, as the new symbol of greatness. But behind that title was a young man who hadn't finished learning how to live, forced to carry a role far bigger than his emotional capacity. He didn't collapse, didn't rebel, didn't complain. He did the only thing he knew how to do: keep moving forward, keep winning, keep silent. And that silence, which began with the US Open 1990 victory, laid the foundation for a parallel life that stretched across decades, where a champion was celebrated by the world, and a lonely human quietly learned to bear success like a burden he could never put down. That victory didn't just defeat the opponent on the other side of the net, it broke off a piece of Pete Sampras's youth, forcing him to grow up too fast in a world that wouldn't let him slow down. And from that moment on, every trophy that followed, no matter how shiny, was always accompanied by the cold echo of one harsh truth. Pete Sampras had become a champion before he had the chance to become himself. After the US Open in 1990, Pete Sampras didn't step into a phase of enjoying the victory. He stepped into another cycle, one colder, heavier, and so repetitive it became a way of life. Wimbledon followed Wimbledon, season after season, the lush green grass courts turning into the familiar backdrop for an unchanging script. Pete appeared, played with precision, showed no emotion, and left with the trophy in hand. The media called it dominance. The fans called it greatness. But for Pete, it was only maintenance. Maintaining order, maintaining control, maintaining a fragile mental state by never allowing anything to slip outside the framework. When he became world #1, then held that position for consecutive years, Pete didn't feel like he was conquering the peak. He felt like he was standing on a slippery surface, where one misstep could make everything collapse. Every season began not with excitement, but with a checklist of pressures that needed to be addressed. Stay in form, make no mistakes, show no weakness, win not out of a hunger for titles, but because if he didn't win, he would have to face an emptiness he had never learned how to fill. Pete didn't enjoy victories, because winning didn't bring lasting safety. It only bought more time before the fear returned. Winning one match solved nothing except to create the next match that had to be won. Every trophy was a reminder that the standard had been raised, that the next time he couldn't afford to be any less. In Pete's world, there was no such thing as enough, only not allowed to stop. And so he kept going, year after year, like a man running on a treadmill with no off switch. Wimbledon, with its history and formality, became the perfect symbol of the life Pete was living. Everything was ritual, standard, precise down to the smallest detail. White clothes, the serve, the footwork, the silence before each point. Pete fit there in a terrifying way. He didn't have to pretend. He just had to be himself in the way he had learned. Total control. But that very fit also locked him tightly into a role with no escape. Every time he lifted the Wimbledon trophy, he didn't get closer to happiness. He only confirmed that he was still not allowed to collapse. Pete's body began to bear the consequences of the non-stop repetition. Dull pains appeared, then faded, then returned. Knees, back, shoulders, all worn down by the packed schedule and brutal training intensity. But Pete didn't see that as a signal to stop. He saw it as an inevitable part of the job. Pain became familiar, like background noise he learned to ignore. If his body spoke up, he tightened his discipline even more. If his mind grew tired, he ramped up control. In Pete's world, there was no room for listening to himself. His mind was drained in a similar way. The focus that once was a safe bunker now became a prison. Pete didn't allow himself distractions, didn't allow himself to loosen up. Every moment had to serve the single goal: keep winning. He no longer remembered what it felt like to play for joy, if it had ever existed. Tennis had become duty, responsibility, the only way to keep everything from falling into chaos. Win to not collapse. Win to not have to face the question he had postponed for far too long. If there were no more victories, who would he be? The repetition created a sense of numbness. Pete moved from tournament to tournament with the same routine, the same habits, the same calm face. He rarely allowed himself to show emotion in public. The rare moments when he did reveal something, they were quickly covered by the return of discipline. People admired that stability, but no one saw the price. The stability didn't come from balance. It came from constantly suppressing the most vulnerable parts of being human. Pete Sampras became world #1 for many years, but he never felt like he was standing at the top. The peak, for him, wasn't a place to enjoy it, was a place where he wasn't allowed to slip. Every day that passed without failure was considered a successful day. But that definition of success carried a deep exhaustion within it. It turned life into an endless series of tasks to complete, with no clear endpoint. There were nights, when the stadium lights were off and the crowds had left, that Pete stayed alone with his thoughts. But even in those private moments, he didn't allow himself to let go. He analyzed, planned, prepared for the next match. The silence didn't bring peace. It only exposed more pressure. And so he returned to the only thing he knew how to do to drown out the unease: keep winning. Victory became a form of control addiction. Not the thrill of the conqueror, but the dependency of someone terrified of losing the only structure keeping him upright. Pete wasn't chasing records to be etched into history. He was chasing records so he wouldn't have to stop and look straight into the emptiness inside. Each new title extended that postponement, but at the same time made the idea of stopping even more terrifying. The world saw a cold, resilient, unshakable Pete Sampras. But inside, he was consuming himself little by little. His body endured. His spirit shrank. Everything ran so smoothly that no one realized the system was running by burning the person inside. Pete didn't call for help. He didn't know how to call for help. He only knew how to win. And it was in that peak period, when Wimbledon followed Wimbledon, when the world #1 position seemed rock solid and unshakable, that Pete Sampras's tragedy became clearest. He had achieved everything an athlete could dream of, but the price was turning victory into the only method of survival. No more joy, no more curiosity, no more space for another kind of life. Only the heavy repetition of a man standing firm by never allowing himself to fall, even if that meant never truly resting. When victory became the method of survival, the pain didn't disappear. It just found a new place to hide. For Pete Sampras, the peak years didn't make his body stronger. They wore him down in the slowest and quietest way possible. The pains started showing up as small signals that were ignored. Shoulders aching after every serve, back stiffening after long matches, knees tingling every time he left the court. There was no dramatic breaking point, no spectacular injury forcing him to stop. Just the steady accumulation of fatigue, like water dripping drop by drop through a wall, built to bear weight until the inside is moldy, while the outside still looks intact. The pressure to maintain the image of never weak meant Pete didn't allow himself to treat pain as a warning. In the world he lived in, admitting pain opened the possibility of being seen, doubted, questioned, and Pete had learned very early that questions like that didn't bring safety. So he handled pain the same way he handled every other emotion. Suppress it, get more disciplined, work harder. If the shoulder hurt, ramp up recovery drills and get back on court. If the back was tired, adjust the training schedule but don't lower the goals. If the mind was exhausted, tighten control even more. There was no room for softness in a system designed to never allow collapse. The locker room became a familiar, isolated space. There, Pete didn't have to play the champion role for the audience, but he also didn't know what else to do except keep silent. The noise from outside was shut out behind the door, but instead of peace, he faced a heavy emptiness. He changed slowly, carefully, as if every movement had to be controlled. No light conversations, no relieved laughter, just the leftover focus after the match and a nameless exhaustion. Pete didn't reach out to anyone to talk about his pains because he didn't have that habit. He also didn't believe that speaking up would help. Long ago, he had learned that enduring was the only way to keep going. Not sharing wasn't because of arrogance, it was because of a lack of skill. Pete didn't know how to ask for help without feeling like he was breaking an invisible rule. He didn't know how to say he was tired, that he was worried, that he was afraid one day his body wouldn't obey anymore. In a professional environment where everyone looked at results, Pete's silence was mistaken for strength. Coaches saw a self-motivated athlete who never complained. Teammates saw someone who didn't cause trouble. The media saw a symbol of stability. And Pete, trapped between those interpretations, kept playing the role of someone who didn't need support. But the price of never showing pain wasn't just physical. It sank deep into his mental life, creating a special kind of loneliness, functional loneliness. Pete still performed efficiently, still won, still completed every task. He had a schedule, goals, achievements, but inside, the sense of connection with others grew thinner and thinner. Relationships became utilitarian. This person for training, that one for planning, someone else for logistics. There was no space for simply being together without serving a specific purpose. Functional loneliness isn't loud. It doesn't make people cry in the middle of the night or collapse publicly. It lets people run smoothly, while the feeling of emptiness keeps spreading wider. Pete could walk onto the court in front of tens of thousands of fans and still feel completely alone. He could be surrounded by his team, but no one was there to ask a simple question. Are you okay today? And because no one asked, he never learned how to ask himself. The chronic injuries forced Pete to face a bitter paradox. His body was sending signals to stop, while his entire life structure was built on never stopping. Every time his body rebelled, he didn't see it as a warning. He saw it as a problem to solve quickly so he could get back in the rhythm. Fatigue became a variable to be eliminated, not a message to be heard. And that constant elimination pushed him further and further from the ability to feel himself. The pressure of the never-weak image also crept into how Pete viewed his own worth. If he allowed himself to admit pain, would he still deserve the title of champion? If he asked for rest, for help, for a lighter load, would he lose the position he had worked so hard to build? Those questions were never spoken, but they controlled every decision. Pete chose the safest path in his understanding. Keep silent, keep enduring, keep winning. That path kept him at the top, but it also shrank his inner world until it felt suffocating. In the locker room, after long matches, Pete often stayed longer than everyone else, not to seek attention, but to postpone the moment he had to step outside and keep playing the role. He sat there, listening to his breathing slow down, feeling the dull pains he would never mention in any interview. There was no one there to witness it, and perhaps no one was allowed to witness it. Pete had become so used to carrying everything alone that sharing felt as foreign as a language he had never learned. Functional loneliness made time pass in a strange way. Day after day, season after season, everything happened on schedule, on rhythm. but the feeling of being fully alive never showed up. Pete didn't fall into despair, but he also never touched joy. He existed in a prolonged gray zone, where tasks were completed while emotions were left suspended indefinitely, and so the exhaustion was never released. It just accumulated, layer upon layer, until it became the default state. The price of never showing pain was the loss of the ability to be comforted. Pete didn't allow anyone to see him weak, so he also didn't allow anyone to get close enough to share the burden. He built a safe distance, but that distance also became a barrier, preventing him from receiving the help he didn't know how to ask for. In a culture that worships toughness, Pete became the perfect model, but that very perfection made him pay with a persistent, quiet, non-dramatic loneliness that stretched on until it was exhausting. When looking back at this period, people might see the titles, the records, the brilliant seasons, but beneath that surface was a silent wearing-down process. The body was drained little by little. The spirit contracted day by day. And in the middle of it all, a man kept stepping onto the court, kept doing everything right, kept not speaking. Pete Sampras never showed the pain, and therefore the pain never had a chance to heal. It simply learned to stay still, to wait, like a shadow following every step of a champion who had grown far too used to enduring in silence. There are losses that don't come as a sudden blow, but as a gradual draining of a person's life force. For Pete Sampras, the death of Tim Gullickson wasn't just the passing of a coach. It was the disappearance of the only person who had ever stood close enough to see him not as the champion, but as himself. Gullickson didn't just teach technique. He gave Pete something he rarely had in his entire life: the feeling of being understood without having to explain. In a world that ran on results and discipline, Gullickson was one of the rare few who allowed Pete to exist as a human being before he was a winning machine. When Gullickson fell seriously ill with brain cancer, Pete didn't say much. He wasn't used to showing fear of loss. He kept competing, kept training, kept silent, as if by doing so, everything could still be controlled. But some things don't obey discipline, don't yield to willpower. When the news of Gullickson's death arrived in 1995, it struck the deepest part of the mental structure Pete had so carefully built. The man who had taught him how to stand firm under pressure was gone. And for the first time, Pete didn't know what to lean on to keep going. Wimbledon 1995 took place in the familiar formal atmosphere, but for Pete, it was an entirely different stage. He walked onto the court not just with a racket, but with unprocessed grief. The match unfolded, point by point, but inside him, everything was cracking. As the pressure built, as fatigue accumulated, as memories of Gullickson flooded back, the mask Pete had worn for so many years began to falter. And then, in the middle of the match, in front of millions of eyes, Pete Sampras broke down in tears. Those weren't tears of defeat. They were the shattering of a man who had suppressed too much for too long. Pete bowed his head. Tears fell. His body trembled in a moment he could no longer control. The Wimbledon stands, so accustomed to composure and order, fell into stunned silence. America was shocked. They had never seen Pete like this. The man known as the symbol of coldness, of iron discipline, of unshakable resolve, now stood in the middle of the court. Raw in grief, he could no longer hide. That moment didn't just stun the audience. It shattered the image Pete had built and protected for years. But at the same time, it exposed a truth few were ready to face. This champion was also a human being who had endured far too much in silence. Pete's tears weren't a sudden outburst of weakness. They were the result of decades of not being allowed to cry, not being allowed to admit that some losses couldn't be fixed by discipline or victory. After that match, Pete kept competing. He kept winning. He kept doing what the world expected of a champion. But something had changed forever. The mask was no longer seamless. A crack had appeared. And though Pete tried to cover it with his familiar professionalism, he knew he wasn't the same person anymore. Gullickson's loss didn't just take away a coach. It took away the rare sense of safety Pete had once had with another human being. From after Wimbledon 1995 onward, Pete's silence carried a different quality. It was no longer just discipline. It was mourning. He continued not to complain, not to explain, but inside, a new void formed. The only person who had ever touched the real human part of him was gone, leaving Pete to face himself without a bridge. The matches that followed were no longer just battles against opponents across the net. They were battles against memory, against unnamed pain. America, after the initial shock, quickly returned to the numbers and titles. The media continued to call Pete the great champion. But the moment of tears at Wimbledon planted an uncomfortable question. Was that greatness built on a foundation too fragile? Pete didn't answer that question. He didn't write a memoir, didn't hold emotional press conferences, didn't turn his pain into an inspirational story. He went back to the only way he knew to survive. Keep silent and keep playing. But from the day the mask cracked, putting it back on became heavier than ever. Pete knew the world had seen a glimpse of the truth, and he knew he could no longer return to the absolute emotionless state of before. Control now required more effort, more discipline, more energy. Every match didn't just drain his body. It also brought back memories of someone who was gone, of a rare connection that no longer existed. Pete Sampras was never the same after that day, not because he weakened professionally, but because a part of his humanity had awakened in pain. He continued to win, continued to stand at the peak, but inside, a wound had opened that had no quick way to heal. The tears at Wimbledon 1995 didn't destroy Pete's career. They only revealed its true cost. And from that moment on, Pete Sampras's tragedy was no longer about whether he could keep winning, but about how long he would have to carry that pain, in silence, before his body and spirit no longer had the strength to keep everything intact as before. After Wimbledon in 1995, when Pete Sampras's mask had cracked once in front of the public eye, people began to look at him more through the lens of comparison. And the name that always appeared alongside him, like an unavoidable opposing mirror, was Andre Agassi. Two men of the same era, same nationality, both dominating American tennis, but carrying within them two completely opposite ways of existing. That contrast wasn't just in their playing styles. It ran deep into how they faced wounds, themselves, and the world. Agassi spoke. Pete swallowed. Agassi stepped into the light with his wounds exposed. He openly talked about hating tennis as a teenager, getting lost in fame, mental breakdowns, mistakes he couldn't hide. He told his story through words, through admission, through allowing others to see the breaking. For Agassi, speaking out wasn't weakness. It was a way to breathe. Every time he shared, a piece of the burden was set down. Every confession became a step closer to healing. Agassi used language like therapy, used exposure to reclaim control over his life. Pete Sampras took the opposite path. He didn't tell his story. He didn't name his pain. He didn't turn loss into words. After that rare moment of tears at Wimbledon, Pete quickly returned to his familiar silence, as if that outburst had been a mistake that needed to be corrected. He didn't believe in speaking out, not because he didn't hurt, but because he didn't know where to start. In Pete's world, words were unreliable. Only action, discipline, and results brought a sense of safety. And so he kept swallowing everything inside, bit by bit. These two paths led to two very different mental destinies. Agassi, despite going through intensely turbulent periods, gradually found peace through understanding and accepting himself. He learned to live with his contradictions instead of trying to eliminate them. Pete, on the other hand, chose to eliminate contradictions by refusing to acknowledge they existed. He built an ever-tighter structure of discipline, believing that if he kept everything in order, pain would have no room to creep in. But the pain didn't disappear. It was only pushed deeper. where it couldn't be seen but continued to affect him. On the court, this opposition created one of the most memorable rivalries in tennis history. Agassi was emotion, chaos, explosion. Pete was control, stability, coldness. Every time they faced each other, it wasn't just a clash of styles, it was a collision of two philosophies of life. The audience was drawn to Agassi because he was more like them, full of contradictions, full of mistakes, but brave enough to speak them. They respected Pete because he represented an almost unattainable ideal, the man who never falls, never complains, never shows weakness. But that very ideal was also the mental trap Pete locked himself into. Agassi allowed himself to be weak, then found ways to get back up. Pete didn't allow himself to be weak, so he never truly got up from the accumulated wounds one healed through words. One buried himself in discipline. Both paths required strength, but only one allowed release. Pete didn't take that path not because he was proud, but because he was never taught that it was a valid choice. In the culture he grew up in, a strong man was a silent man, and Pete lived that truth so thoroughly that it killed off the ability to choose anything else. The most painful thing in this contrast isn't who achieved more on court. History has recorded both in different ways. The pain lies in this. When Agassi began speaking about his pain, the world listened and responded. When Pete stayed silent, the world accepted it as part of who he was, without asking any more questions. No one asked Pete what he was carrying behind that calm exterior. No one asked whether his silence was a choice or just a habit that had taken root since childhood. Two paths, two mental destinies, no absolute right or wrong. But looking back, that difference highlights the tragedy of Pete Sampras. He didn't fall short in achievements, but he lacked the spaces to feel relief. He didn't lack strength, but he lacked the tools to handle pain beyond enduring it. Agassi walked through chaos to find peace. Pete walked through discipline to keep chaos from erupting. Both survived, but in very different ways. After Wimbledon 1995, when America had seen Pete cry, the comparison with Agassi became even sharper. One turned a moment of weakness into the beginning of self-understanding. The other turned that moment into an exception, then quickly locked the emotional door again. Pete didn't follow Agassi's example. He didn't change his path. He continued in silence, continued in control, continued swallowing pain the way he had his whole life. And it was in that choice, full of discipline and dignity, that Pete Sampras's tragedy became clearer than ever. A man strong enough to defeat every opponent, but too accustomed to enduring alone to allow himself to be healed. Pete Sampras's departure wasn't like any farewell America was used to. There was no victory tour, no long speeches on center court, no tearful retrospectives. He didn't stand under the lights to thank the crowd, didn't turn back for one last wave, didn't leave behind any message explaining why he stopped. Pete Sampras simply disappeared, quietly, coldly, the way he had lived most of his life at the top. And that very silence made the exit feel more like surrender than a final victory. After the U.S. Open in 2002, where he won his 14th Grand Slam title, Pete didn't say that was his last match. He didn't say he still had the hunger to continue. There were no promises, no announced plans for the future. He just stopped. In a sports world where legends usually cling to the spotlight with comebacks, coaching roles, television commentary, Pete's silence became baffling. Many waited for him to return, at least to say a proper goodbye. But Pete didn't come back. He didn't give the world that opportunity. The absence of thanks wasn't because he lacked appreciation, but because Pete didn't know what to thank. Thank the victories? They had taken too much. Thank the courts? They were his refuge, but also his prison. Thank the fans? Their love was always tied to the condition of winning. Pete understood that if he stood there and said farewell, he would have to play the champion role one more time. And by that point, he no longer had the strength to keep up that performance. There was no nostalgia in the way Pete left, because nostalgia requires turning back to look, and looking back, for Pete, meant facing everything he had swallowed for 30 years. The unnamed pains, the unacknowledged exhaustion, the parts of himself sacrificed to maintain the perfect image. Pete didn't go back to look at the trophies because they didn't tell the whole story. He didn't go back to remind anyone of the records because the records didn't explain why he was burned out. That quiet departure wasn't an impulsive decision. It was the result of a long, wearing-down process. The body had sent enough signals. The mind had endured enough pressure. The champion's mask, after cracking at Wimbledon in 1995, had never truly been repaired. Every time he stepped onto the court, Pete had to spend more energy just to keep everything intact. And at some point, he realized he no longer had enough strength to keep pretending everything was fine. Pete left when he no longer had the energy to sustain the role. But he didn't call it failure. He didn't call it victory either. He didn't name the departure, because naming it would mean having to explain, and Pete had never been good at explaining his inner life. He chose the only way he knew: silence. Silence like a door closing without noise, without impact, but final. In the years that followed, Pete's absence became more noticeable than ever. He didn't show up at major tournaments. He didn't coach. He didn't comment on the next generation. He didn't debate his legacy. America kept talking about tennis, kept creating new legends, but Pete Sampras stood outside it all. He didn't insert himself into the collective memory, didn't try to stay at the center of the story. He accepted being remembered by the numbers, rather than by his own voice. That prolonged silence led many to think Pete was cold, distant, even ungrateful. But perhaps the truth is simpler and far more painful. Pete Sampras didn't leave because he didn't love tennis. He left because he had loved it in a way that left no room for himself to breathe. When he could no longer carry the image the world had placed on his shoulders, he chose to disappear rather than collapse in front of everyone. Pete's silent exit didn't close the story with liberation. It only marked the moment when a man finally allowed himself to stop, even if he didn't know what would come next. No lights, no applause, no goodbye, just a long silence, where for the first time in his life, Pete Sampras didn't have to step onto the court to prove anything, and no longer had the strength to keep playing the role of the man who was never allowed to be weak. After leaving the stage of victory, Pete Sampras stepped into a phase where, for the first time in his life, he wasn't measured by points. His marriage to Bridget Wilson didn't happen under blinding lights, nor was it performed as an extension of his fame. It took place quietly, privately, almost in complete opposition to the champion image America once knew. For Pete Sampras, this wasn't a calculated turning point. It was a place to stop, a place that didn't require him to win, didn't require him to be perfect, didn't require him to prove anything anymore. In that marriage, Pete existed for the first time without carrying the role. He didn't need to be world number one. He didn't need to maintain the cold, untouchable image. He didn't need to hide exhaustion behind discipline. With Bridget, Pete wasn't loved for his achievements. He was loved for who he was. That difference, fragile as it was, created a crack for light to slip through. Family became a refuge, where the rhythm of life slowed down, where mornings didn't start with training schedules and evenings didn't end with match analysis. But that light wasn't strong enough to erase the darkness that had accumulated over decades. Old wounds didn't disappear just because the environment changed. Pete entered the marriage not as someone who had just been healed, but as someone carrying an entire storehouse of memories that had never been opened. He was used to control, used to not speaking, used to enduring alone. Even in this safe space, those habits remained. Pete didn't easily share what he had swallowed for 30 years. He loved in a careful, cautious way, as if afraid that letting go too much might cause everything to collapse. Family gave Pete a sense of protection, but it didn't automatically bring healing. Quiet nights in a house without the sound of crowds sometimes made memories rise more clearly. When there was no longer a tournament schedule to cling to, when there was no immediate goal to conquer, Pete faced the emptiness he had postponed for too long. There were moments when he realized he didn't know what to do with peace. Peace, for someone who had lived on constant tension, was an unfamiliar state. Bridget didn't try to turn Pete into someone else. She didn't force him to speak, didn't demand he explain. Her presence was more like an invitation than a demand. An invitation to stay, to rest, to exist without the role. But Pete needed time to believe that invitation was real, that this love came without conditions, that if he didn't win today, no one would leave him tomorrow. Those lessons couldn't be learned overnight, especially for someone who had tied his self-worth to results throughout his youth. That private marriage wasn't a fairy tale story that healed every wound. It was a slow process, where Pete learned to breathe without needing victory as a reason. There were days when he still carried the old tension, still reacted as if he were in the middle of a season. There were times when he retreated into familiar silence, not because he didn't love, but because he didn't yet know how to open up. Family was a refuge, but it was also a mirror reflecting parts of himself Pete had never faced. Even so, just having a place to come home to was already a huge difference. Pete no longer had to travel constantly, no longer had to live to the rhythm of the courts. Evenings with family, simple everyday moments, gradually created a new kind of stability. Not the stability of rankings, but the stability of being allowed to stay, staying with someone else, staying with himself, even if it was still awkward and full of caution. The light of this marriage was faint, because it couldn't shine straight into the dark corners that had existed too long. But precisely because it was faint, it didn't blind Pete. It didn't force him to change faster than he could bear. It simply existed, steadily, like a reminder that there was another way to live, besides always having to be strong. Pete wasn't healed yet, but he was no longer completely alone. And for someone who had grown used to enduring in silence, that alone was enough to save him from falling even deeper into isolation. The marriage didn't erase the past, but it created a future that could be endured. Pete Sampras didn't become a new person, open, expressive, emotional overnight. He remained the quiet, controlled, careful man. But in the family space, his silence no longer carried absolute defense. It began to have safe gaps, places where he didn't need to prove he deserved to stay. A marriage that saved him not because it healed every wound, but because it gave Pete a reason not to keep running away. It didn't pull him out of the darkness with blinding light. It placed a small lamp along the path, just enough so he wouldn't stumble when he stopped. And in the life of a man who had lived too long by moving forward without pause, the ability to stop without collapsing was the most fragile yet truest form of salvation. When Pete Sampras became a father, the greatest fear of his life no longer lived on the court. It lived in the quiet evenings, when he watched his child sleep, and suddenly realized a truth that tightened his heart. He wasn't afraid of his child failing. He was afraid his child would live the way he once lived. Afraid his child would learn silence too early. Afraid his child would swallow emotions to survive. Afraid his child would grow up in a world where love came tied to invisible conditions of achievement. Fatherhood didn't bring Pete the confidence he felt when holding a racket. Instead, it opened a new layer of anxiety. He understood too well the price of growing up under unnamed pressure, because he had lived fully inside it for decades. Pete knew children don't need to be yelled at or publicly forced in order to be hurt. Sometimes, just an environment where emotions are never asked about, where strength is defined as silence, is enough to plant the seed for a lifetime of a shrinking inner world. And he didn't want to be the one who unintentionally passed that pattern on to his own child. The fear of repeating himself made Pete pull even further back from the lights, not because he hated his past, but because he didn't want that past to cast a shadow over his child's childhood. He understood that fame always carries expectations, even when no one says them out loud. A famous last name, a father who is a legend, a history repeated in articles, all of it could become invisible pressure, seeping into the way a child views their own worth. Pete had lived his entire life under that invisible pressure. He didn't want his child to have to learn how to endure it from such an early age. So Pete chose to step back. He didn't put his children in the spotlight. He didn't use family stories to polish his public image. He didn't let the media define his child's childhood with catchy headlines. In those years, Pete learned to be present in a different way. Less loud, less controlling, more listening, even though it wasn't easy at all. He had to fight his old reflexes, the urge to organize, to direct, to make sure everything was done right. Fatherhood forced him to face a hard question. How do you protect your child without turning that protection into another form of control? Pete didn't want his child to tie their self-worth to results. He didn't want his child to believe love comes from doing things right, doing them well, doing them better than others. But to do that, he had to learn things he himself was never taught. He had to learn to say, "It's okay" when things weren't perfect. Learn to allow emotions to exist without needing to fix them right away. Learn to be there without turning presence into a lesson in discipline. Those were lessons harder than any final he ever played. There were times when Pete realized he was standing in front of a mirror of his own past, an unconscious gesture, a slip of words, a moment of prolonged silence, and the worry rose. Was he repeating himself? Would his quietness become distance? Would his protection accidentally create another kind of pressure? Those questions didn't have clear answers. But unlike before, Pete didn't run from them by winning. He stayed with them, even in the anxiety. Fatherhood made Pete understand that healing isn't just about himself. It's also a responsibility to the next generation. He couldn't change his own past, but he could slow the flow of old patterns. He could choose to be more present, even if awkwardly. He could choose to step out of the lights, even if that meant letting his legacy be understood through cold numbers. For Pete, that price was acceptable. If, in exchange, it meant a lighter childhood for his child, the anxiety didn't disappear. It became a quiet companion to Pete in his role as a father. But unlike the pressure of the court, this anxiety didn't push him to control more tightly. It reminded him to be more careful with himself, to learn to speak when needed, to learn to apologize, to learn to stay in moments that weren't perfect. Pete wasn't sure he did everything right, but for the first time, he accepted that being a father wasn't a competition to win. The generational tragedy of Pete Sampras isn't about whether he became a good father, but about the deep fear that what once hurt him might unintentionally be passed on. It's that very fear that made him choose a path with less glory, fewer applause, but more humanity. Pete stepped out of the lights not to escape, but to protect. And in that quiet withdrawal, he was doing the hardest thing of his life, breaking a loop that had existed for too long, by choosing to stay with his child, with the worry, and with the responsibility not to let silence become the legacy. There was one match Pete Sampras was never prepared for, not because of a lack of discipline, not because of a lack of will, but because this time, the opponent didn't stand on the other side of the net, and every rule that had helped him survive his entire life suddenly became useless. When his wife, Bridget Wilson, was diagnosed with cancer, Pete stepped into a battle for the first time without a strategy, without an opening serve, without a scoreboard to cling to. Only the raw truth of human existence. There are things you cannot control, no matter how much of your life you've spent learning to control everything. The bad news arrived quietly, without media, without lights. But for Pete, it rang like a deep crack in his chest. The woman who had become his fragile refuge, who had given him a life that didn't require proof, now faced a threat he couldn't defeat with coldness or discipline. For the first time, Pete couldn't train harder to fix the problem, couldn't focus more to turn the tide. Every familiar reflex failed right from the start. Pete had faced the pressure of millions, stood in finals where one small mistake could cost everything, but he had never felt this powerless. The court, no matter how brutal, was still a place he understood the rules. Cancer didn't care. It didn't care how many titles you'd won, how disciplined you'd lived, how much you'd endured. It didn't negotiate. And Pete, the man who had lived his whole life without showing fear, was forced to face the most primal fear, the fear of losing the person he loved. For the first time, Pete couldn't completely hide that fear. Not in front of the noisy media, but in the rare, brief moments he shared enough for people to understand he was trembling. Not trembling like a champion about to lose a match, but like a human being standing at the fragile edge of loss. Pete didn't use big words. He didn't tell a heroic story. But that very restraint made the pain clearer. Because for Pete, admitting fear was already a step beyond every old pattern. Daily life turned into a long chain of tense moments. Hospital corridors replaced locker rooms. Conversations with doctors replaced tactical meetings. Pete listened to unfamiliar medical terms with the same focus he once gave to the most critical points. But this time, focus didn't bring a sense of control. It only made him more aware of his limits. He could be there, could hold her hand, could be present, but he couldn't do what he was best at: guarantee a win. There were nights when Pete lay awake, listening to his wife's breathing, feeling fear rise like a wave he couldn't stop. No applause to drown it out, no schedule to distract him, just time passing with cruel slowness. Pete, who had once used discipline to push away every emotion, now had nowhere left to hide. And for the first time, he didn't try to swallow the fear. He let it stay there heavy, present, because he understood that denying it wouldn't protect anyone. The most painful thing in this match wasn't the weakening of the body, but that Pete had to learn to live with uncertainty. Tennis always gave him clarity. There was winning, losing, an end. Illness didn't. It dragged on, vague, and forced a person to accept that not every story has structure. Pete stood on the sidelines not as a champion, but as a husband, a father, a human trying not to let fear paralyze him. In that fragility, Pete gradually understood a painful but necessary truth. Strength isn't always in the ability to control. Sometimes, strength lies in staying when you're powerless, staying in the hospital, staying through the waiting days for results, staying when there's nothing to do but love and hope. This was the hardest match of his life, because there was no decisive shot to end it, only the endurance of love, day by day, hour by hour. Pete Sampras didn't emerge from this phase as a winner in the familiar sense, but he emerged with something his legendary career had never given him: the ability to admit he wasn't invincible, not on the court, not in life. And it was in that powerlessness that a different kind of courage took shape. Not loud, not glorious, just a man standing firm not because he could control the outcome, but because he didn't run when there was nothing left to control. The hardest match of Pete's life was never recorded in any statistics. No title, no record. But it cut deeper than any final he ever played. Because for the first time, Pete Sampras didn't fight to prove he was strong. He fought to hold on to the most fragile things. And in the world of a man who had lived too long by discipline, daring to admit that fear was the most painful, yet most human step he ever took. When looking back on Pete Sampras's journey, the question is no longer about how many titles he won or how long he held the world #1 spot. The question slows down, goes deeper, and hurts more. What was the real price of that greatness? Pete never actively built a public legacy. He didn't write a memoir to tell his life story in an easily digestible way. He didn't stand in front of cameras to define the meaning of victory. He didn't seek belated recognition for the sacrifices he made. If history remembers him, it's through cold numbers, not through his own narration. Pete didn't want to become an inspirational figure in the conventional sense. He didn't stand up and say, "You can do it too, just like me," perhaps because he understood better than anyone that the path he took was not something that should be copied. Pete's greatness wasn't built on a continuous series of brilliant moments, but on a long chain of self-amputations to fit the winning mold. He reached the peak not by expanding himself as a person, but by shrinking himself until only the parts that served control and victory remained. The first price was his youth, not in the sense of time passing, but in the sense of experiences that never happened. Pete didn't have the youthful wandering that leads to finding oneself. He didn't have mistakes allowed in the dark. He stepped into the champion role before he had even formed an identity outside the court. His youth was shortened, compressed, and shaped by expectations he never had the chance to choose. While others learned how to live, Pete learned how to stay on the rails. The second price was emotion. Pete didn't lose his emotions because he was weak. He lost them because he was too good at controlling them. He learned not to cry, not to complain, not to share. Emotions that weren't allowed to exist publicly gradually lost the language to express themselves. And when there's no language, they don't disappear, they accumulate. Pete lived an efficient life, but one that was impoverished in the ability to self-soothe. He wasn't used to being comforted, and he wasn't used to needing comfort. That was a kind of deficit no one could see on the record books. The biggest price, and the most painful, was the ability to be weak. Not weakness as failure, but weakness as a human right. Pete traded away that right very early. He didn't allow himself to collapse, so he also didn't allow himself to be lifted up. He didn't allow himself to reveal, so he also didn't allow others to get close. In a world that worships toughness, Pete became the ideal model. But that very ideal forced him to live a spiritually lonely life, where every burden had to be carried alone. Pete didn't seek recognition for those losses. He didn't ask the world to understand him, perhaps because he never really believed the world needed to understand. He was used to existing without being asked about, and he didn't expect it at the end of the journey either. Pete's silence after retirement wasn't an image strategy. It was the natural continuation of a life built on not speaking. So, when we ask about the price of greatness, the answer isn't in a number or a moment. It lies in the things that never happened. The times Pete didn't say what he was afraid of, the times he didn't stop when he was exhausted, the connections that could have been deeper but were never formed. Pete became great, in a way very few people are disciplined enough to follow, and very few are brave enough to refuse. This is a kind of greatness no one wants to emulate, because it demands sacrifices with no clear spiritual reward. It brings titles, but doesn't guarantee peace. It creates a legend, but leaves the human being behind. Pete Sampras isn't a lesson in how to win the most. He's a reminder of what winning can take away if it becomes the only way to survive. At the end of the journey, when the lights are off and the applause is only memory, Pete doesn't stop to inventory his legacy. He doesn't ask himself if he was remembered enough. Perhaps the only question left, though it was never spoken, is whether that price could have been paid another way. And it's the silence around that question that makes Pete Sampras's story more heartbreaking than any loud tragedy. A man who reached the absolute pinnacle of sport, but had to trade away the most human parts of himself to keep it from collapsing. Today, Pete Sampras no longer steps onto the court amid the noise of expectations. He lives a quiet life, detached from the rhythm of modern tennis, where everything is measured by constant presence and non-stop voices. The Pete Sampras of today doesn't try to come back, nor does he attempt to explain why he left the way he did. He stands firm, but not in the sense of victory. He stands firm in the way of someone who has given everything he had and finally accepted stopping without needing a single word of justification. Pete is not fully healed. The cracks don't disappear just because time passes. A life built on control cannot be dismantled by external peace alone. Old reflexes still exist. Silence when overloaded, withdrawal when emotions rise, choosing order over confrontation. There are quiet mornings when everything seems okay, and there are unexpected moments when memories surge without warning. Pete doesn't try to chase them away. He has learned that denial only makes them return stronger. But Pete still stands firm. Not because he has resolved every wound, but because he no longer runs from them. That standing firm doesn't look like a champion raising a trophy high. It is the quiet patience of someone who accepts that some parts of himself will never be neatly arranged. Pete no longer forces himself to be perfect. He allows himself to live with mismatched pieces, unfilled gaps, unanswered questions. Pete Sampras's double life ended not with a final victory, but with the belated acknowledgement that he was also human. Not just a walking system of discipline, not just a collection of titles, not just the cold image the media loved. He acknowledged, though never in words, that he had been afraid, tired, lonely, and had endured too long in silence. That acknowledgement didn't happen on a podium. It happened in everyday life, where Pete allowed himself not to prove anything to anyone. Perhaps the hardest thing for Pete wasn't letting go of the titles, but letting go of the role of the man who is never weak, the role of the one who always controls, the role of the champion who needs no one to lift him up. When that role was set down, Pete didn't instantly become someone else. He simply became himself, a man who had lived too long in discipline, now relearning how to live with emotions without seeing them as threats. Pete Sampras today doesn't seek recognition. He doesn't need the world to confirm that his sacrifices were worth it. Perhaps because he understands that no answer would ever be complete enough for that question. His greatness happened. The price was paid. What remains is not evaluation, but how to live the rest of life after the lights go out. And Pete chose to live slowly, privately, far enough away to not be pulled back into the old rhythm. The acceptance came late, but it was not meaningless. It didn't erase the lost years, but it stopped those losses from continuing to multiply. Pete didn't try to heal in the way the world prefers. No slogans, no declarations, no noisy comeback. He accepted that some wounds will always be there, as part of his human structure. And for Pete, acceptance was a braver act than any match-deciding serve. This ending doesn't bring complete redemption. There is no closing scene with a radiant smile or promises of the future. Only a man who survived. Survived the pressure, the expectations, himself. Pete Sampras is not fully healed, and perhaps he doesn't need to be. What matters is that he no longer denies the truth that he hurt, that he was weak, and that he was human from beginning to end. In a world that loves complete recovery stories, Pete's story stops at a different point. Late, but genuine acceptance. No final victory, no explanation. Just the quiet of a continuing life, where a legend no longer has to tense up to exist. And in that quiet, Pete Sampras, no longer an icon, finally allows himself to be an ordinary human, standing firm not because he is healed, but because he has stopped running. The story of Pete Sampras doesn't make people sad because he failed, but because he won too much in silence. Reading his entire journey again, the greatest sorrow isn't in the chronic injuries, or the moment he cried at Wimbledon 1995 after Tim Gullickson's death. It lies in how a human being had to learn to swallow emotions to survive. Pete grew up in an environment that saw weakness as something to eliminate, and tennis became the only place he felt safe. But that very refuge gradually turned into a cage, where winning no longer brought joy but only served as a way not to collapse. His glorious career from the U.S. Open in 1990 to the string of Wimbledons and the years holding the world #1 spot is not told here as glory, but as a cold loop. Pete won not to live fully, but to maintain fragile control. When he retired, he left without a goodbye, because he was exhausted from holding up the role of the man who is never weak. That hurts more than any defeat, because it reflects a very American tragedy, a society that worships discipline, achievement, and toughness, but rarely asks the winner what they had to give up. Yet, this story also honors Pete Sampras on a deeper level, not for the number of grand slams, but because he dared to stop, dared to withdraw, to protect his family, to not repeat the invisible wounds with his children. The lesson for Americans from this story is clear. Success should not be built on denying emotions. True strength is not only in enduring, but in the ability to admit you are human too. Pete Sampras is not fully healed, but that very late acceptance has made him a more human figure than any perfect legend. If the story of Pete Sampras makes you slow down for a moment to think about the silent price of greatness, please hit subscribe to the channel so we can continue this journey together through real and deeply human stories like this one. Thank you for listening all the way to the end, and see you in the next video, where legends are told not just through victories, but through the very things they had to endure in silence.